Hello and welcome to the Qubit Guy podcast brought to you by Classiq, the quantum algorithm design company. My name is Yuval and my guest today is Andre Konig. Andre is a quantum investor, entrepreneur, and author. We spoke about how private equity and governments are investing in quantum computing, about the gaps he sees in the markets, and much more. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please let us know how we did by emailing hello@classiq.io. That's hello@classiq.io. Hello, Andre, and thanks for joining me today.
Great to see you, Yuval, and hear you. Happy Tuesday to all listeners.
So who are you and what do you do?
My name is Andre Konig, calling in out of beautiful South Beach, Miami Beach, overlooking the beach here from my little stand-up desk. I'm originally from Germany. I grew up all over Europe. Moved to the US 20 years ago, spent 15 years in New York City. I'm more of your typical business guy by trade, studied economics at the University of Chicago, hold an MBA in strategic management, spent over a decade with the big management consulting houses, built a consulting firm myself from 0 up to 300 consultants, but found myself always working at the intersection of corporate strategy and technology, starting with billing systems, customer relationship management systems, enterprise resource systems, and so forth in the late 90s and early 2000s, slowly into digital and other technologies later in my career. And about a decade ago, living just a couple blocks away from IBM's new downtown Manhattan building that they had erected for their artificial intelligence efforts, IBM Watson. I had been asked if I wanted to start a company for them to explore specific vertical use cases in artificial intelligence, which I did with my partner, Christian York, and started an effort on signal detection out of unstructured data for Wall Street, exited that 4 years ago, and on the prompting of my largest client and friend at that point, started to look into quantum technologies, which in his words was the true paradigm shifting technology that was the most exciting one. Went to MIT, took all those classes, didn't have enough brain power and energy to do a PhD, but at least learned some of the scientific foundations in it, and started 3 different ventures in quantum technology that I've been running full time for the last 3 years.
So what are these quantum ventures?
The first one, Interference Advisors, I always say it's a little bit of the pitch book of quantum technologies. If you're familiar with that vendor, we collected about 30,000 data points on the quantum tech ecosystem globally. Who are the vendors, the users, the use cases, the startups, the investors, the technology, and so forth. And we provide that data and analysis around it to investors, governments, executives around the world to help them in their decision making, be it strategic or investment wise. We also do projects recently for the Department of Defense here in the US, a gap analysis on the current state of quantum technologies and future state in the US market. So trying to really bring facts and data to a very young and still immature and small but fast growing ecosystem. One Quantum, technically still an LLC, but a nonprofit in spirit, is a global quantum tech community organization organized in chapters. Most of our chapters are regional. We launched 2 chapters this week in South Africa and in Kenya. We have chapters in India and Nepal, in Latin America, hopefully in Europe soon. Would love to start one in Israel if we can get that done, Yuval. We also have a startup chapter and very famously a Women in Quantum chapter, which attracts very large crowds at our conferences. And lastly, I have a small little investment fund, Entanglement Capital, that operates a startup accelerator for quantum tech growth stage companies.
Excellent. So let's start with the community. How large is the community in your chapters? How many people are we talking about?
Every chapter is different and operated by a volunteer president. So we recruit folks locally that work in quantum tech or want to work in quantum tech and build these ecosystems and communities. Our Nepal chapter, our email list is roughly 500 people now. At our events, we get 40 to 60 participants, and a handful actually joined as paying members. Women in Quantum, led by Denise Ruffner from INQ, our largest chapter, we get 2,000 to 3,000 people at our Women in Quantum summits. We have hundreds of members in our membership service, where we offer a member directory, resources, contacts, networking, and so forth, and constantly growing. So the overall number fluctuates a lot between events that we do and what we constantly offer, which is an evolving kind of value proposition, but it's in the thousands at this point.
If you look at the investment side, certainly looks like there's a lot of money being poured into quantum these days, whether through the public markets or through venture capital. Are you seeing the same thing?
I think that is a very important question, Yuval. Obviously, we're all excited about quantum technologies, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? And yes, investments and investor appetite in quantum technologies is growing, but not quite as strongly as some of the mainstream media might lead you to believe. We did an analysis of all publicly announced venture capital and angel investments, so private investors, private money into quantum computing last year, and it was just about $1 billion USD, which was more than the previous year, but still a relatively small market and something that hadn't been growing significantly. We just recently looked at the first 5 months of 2021 and compared that to the first 5 months of 2020, and we noticed that actually the investment market hadn't grown at all. There were 3 very large deals this year that everybody who is a little bit interested in quantum is familiar with. SPAC deals, public offering deals around INQ and others. If you take those statistical tail ends out, we had just about $223 million invested in the first 5 months of 2021, which compares to $230 million over the same period last year. So that market is holding very steady. What is more interesting is that the average deal count is down from 28 over that period last year to 17 this year, and the average deal size correspondingly up significantly. So we see more later stage investments to support and fuel the growth of ventures, and we see fewer bootstrapped seed or angel type of investments to support new ideas and new entrants in this startup race on the quantum tech side. So yes, the market is growing, but it is not kind of everybody is a swimming in money type of ecosystem at this point.
Do you also track government investments? Because I know that several governments are looking at quantum as a strategic opportunity and are putting a pretty significant money into quantum projects in their countries or regions.
We do, and everybody has probably heard about China and their huge commitment of speculated $11 billion into quantum technologies, and we're not actually exactly sure what that is for, but that is a huge number and probably the leader of the pack. If you compare that to other regions, notably the US, where you stand at about $2.5 billion currently in committed money, but you have bills on the US Senate floor for many billions more, and you have many other organizations such as the Department of Energy, NIST, DARPA, and others pouring in smaller grant amounts that inflate that total to a significantly larger number. That compares to much smaller numbers in Europe, at least historically. Over the last year, that has changed. France announced a €2 billion program. Germany at this point has invested close to 5 billion. between state and federal grants into quantum computing. And all taken together, the European Union, in terms of government grants, is now the leader of the pack. The UK also has a very strong national initiative. Then we have other countries like Australia, India, and Israel, of course, that announced national strategies that are very well funded. Israel, I believe, announced $350 million to support the local quantum tech ecosystem. And those numbers are very similar in India, Australia, Japan, and a couple other places. So very well funded. Actually, Angela Merkel, our outgoing German chancellor, just yesterday at a press conference said that Germany needs to spend like it never spent before if they want to stay competitive in this international technology race. So governments see the importance of this and are spending as much as they can.
Given that you organize local chapters, that you track deals, and that you also have a small venture capital firm, you probably have very good perspective on whether the US, for instance, is leading or is behind or is about the same as other countries. I mean, can you point to a geographical leader in terms of the level of interest, the number of companies, and so on?
Define what leadership means. If you take this quantitative view on it, the US and North America is certainly leading. We always, citing very rough numbers, track roughly 500 startups within quantum information science, so not just quantum computing, but also quantum encryption, sensing, and communications globally. 300 of those are in North America. Close to 200 in quantum computing, and roughly half of those in hardware and the other half in software. So by sheer numbers, that is the leading market by far, compared to Germany, for example, that invests huge amounts of money over the last 12 months, where we barely have a dozen different startups, and that is the same in Israel, in Australia, in France, in the UK. UK actually has a couple dozen different startups and so forth. You also see the big vendors, IBM, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and so forth in the US that are extremely active in this space, which is very unique as well. In Europe, you have a very strong user base. Companies like, and here Germany is leading, Volkswagen, BMW, Bosch, BASF, and many others, have been experimenting with the applications of different quantum technologies for many years already, and continue to invest into this significantly. The Netherlands is a very strong market here, more focused on quantum communications and encryption. And then you have very strong national programs that are a lot more coordinated. I know that is the case in Israel and in Australia, in Japan, which has a very strong ecosystem between NEC, Fujitsu, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, the local universities, and a very small startup system to deliver on national priorities. If you take a more qualitative look at it and kind of try to intersect this sheer numbers game with the quality of the research and the quality of the private capital and the quality of the use cases, I think Europe truly plays a leading role, especially since the European Horizon program and other pan-European efforts have come on the scene that have fostered a very strong cooperation and collaboration between the key European actors, and combine superb basic research with a strong strategy of commercializing this. If you take a national perspective at this, and I think that is very important because it has defense and security applications, you can absolutely not neglect what China is doing, especially on the quantum communications and encryption side.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you did a gap analysis, I think, for the Department of Defense, without getting into the specific results and the specific questions. But through your hat as an investor, where do you see the gaps in quantum computing today? Is it in cloud services? Is it hardware? Is it software? Something that's application specific? What's your view on that?
Many gaps, and I think the answer to that question again depends on what your goal is. What I can say about the study for the Department of Defense is the perspective was in the medium term, let's say the next decade, and how do we secure the quantum infrastructure. And in that respect, the workforce was the main key success factor that we looked at, and the biggest gap. How do we graduate sufficient PhDs in physics and related fields, but how do we also build the ecosystem of developers, analysts, business folks that understand the space, and the next generation of students to really make sure we're able to deliver on all of these initiatives. And that is a huge concern. And the data, unfortunately, validated that not only in the US, but most likely in all the large global markets. Beyond that, I think the biggest gap and the biggest challenge is how do we avoid quantum fatigue? And a lot of folks use this term quantum winter that I'm trying to avoid here because it's been overused at this point. But as much as we've delivered tremendous progress, especially on the product and technology side of quantum technologies, we have failed to deliver a bottom line impact. Yet we have brought in many corporate partners, many private investors, board of directors, people that are itching to see bottom line results to justify their investments and financial resources and time. I think that will be the biggest struggle. And how do we solve that? Through cloud offerings, through consulting offerings, through hybrid classical quantum offerings in the near term is another key challenge.
When you look at the amount of investments that you mentioned earlier, what do you attribute that stagnation to, that the total investment is about the same as it was last year?
I had a conversation with one of the very large venture capital funds a few months ago. Their line of thinking was that we made one big investment, and that is basically the equivalent of we put our chips on the table, but we're not going to double down on it. We're just going to sit at the table, try to understand how this game of quantum technologies is going to pan out and observe it for a while. So I think everybody wants a seat at the table, but lacking a clear understanding of what the timeline of our product roadmaps are, what revenue models will be, what go-to-market channels will be successful. There isn't yet the appetite to really build big portfolios of investments in quantum technologies, and rightly so. Obviously, you then have a lot of less professional money that wants to get into this game. And I think there we just see a lack of resources to, number one, get the deal flow. You can't really just pick up the yellow pages and look for a quantum computing startup or quantum tech startup. And number two, how do you do the due diligence, especially when you start to look at hardware or algorithms? That is extremely, extremely difficult to do and a challenge for everybody. So I think we're just extremely resource constrained on that front.
So as we move closer to the end of our conversation today, what kind of deals are you looking for in your venture fund? What kind of companies are interesting to you?
Entanglement Capital, our hypothesis is that through the communities and chapters at One Quantum, we have deal flow that is earlier and larger than many others. We're privileged to see a lot of teams emerge before others and build close relationship with founders. Through Interference Advisors, we also have a lot of data that allows us to build some early benchmarks and comparables to do some sort of due diligence that might hopefully be more insightful than others as well. So combining these two is our investment thesis, especially as we look at the growth stage startups, teams that have raised their government grant money, maybe some early research partnerships with paying customers, and are now looking to scale that, go for their first bigger check size, but need some help in building up these metrics that VC investors like to see. That is an opportunity that I think is still underserved in the quantum tech market.
Very interesting. So how can people get in touch with you to learn more about your work?
AndreKonig.com is the best way to do it. You'll see a bunch of my silly videos and other references, but most importantly, a contact form and all my social media channels. So just go to AndreKonig.com, and I'd love to hear from you.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Andre, for joining me today.
Thank you, Yuval, for having me.